From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we're dealing with a very painful subject, the disappearance, maybe the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal was a good friend of many of us and a colleague. We'd hosted him many times at the Middle East Institute events. Has a long career in Saudi Arabia as a journalist and a commentator and head of media institutions. In the past, relied upon to be close to sort of decision makers and what they're thinking and so on. And in recent years had become a critic of Saudi policy or some Saudi policies, ended up moving mainly to the U.S. And raising his voice from here, became a commentator at the Washington Post as well. As I'm sure all of you listening to us today know, he disappeared last Tuesday. He went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, and as far as we know, never came out. Conflicting reports about whether he did come out, whether he was killed in the embassy, in the consulate, whether he was taken back to Saudi Arabia. Very, very concerning news. We're all rather shocked and saddened with this. We still hope that Jamal is still alive. Our thoughts are with his family, his kids, and many of those who knew him. We today in the podcast are going to examine, as a think tank, look at least maybe the impact of how this crisis develops. It is the biggest sort of crisis, perhaps, between the Trump this administration of the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. It's also a big crisis between Ankara and Riyadh, between the Turkish government and the Saudi government. And with me to discuss this developing crisis or tragedy and to explore what it might mean and what impacts it might have are my two of my colleagues, Dr. Gonul, who's Senior Fellow and Director of our Turkey program here at the Institute. Gonul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paul.
And my colleague, Ambassador Jerry Feierstein, who's Director of Policy Programs and Government Relations at MEI. Jerry, thanks also for being with us.
Good to be with you.
Jerry, let me start let me start where the incident happened in Turkey. I was going to say we're in Washington, so let's start there, but the incident happened in Istanbul. So, Gonul, walk us through maybe what the Turkish government, how it's dealing with this. Their narratives have changed over the days, how President Erdogan is managing or not managing this crisis.
Well, a few days after he disappeared, unnamed Turkish officials leaked. They talked to Western media and said that they had proof that Jamal was killed in the Saudi embassy. And President Erdogan's one of his close advisors, Yasin Aktay, also in his column, he wrote that the officials had proof that he was killed. And yet, for a while, President Erdogan didn't say anything. And last Sunday, we were expecting him to say something concrete about the situation, but he didn't really name names. And he said that he was hopeful, that he was praying for Jamal's safe return. But at the beginning of the week, again, I think he had a more aggressive argument, basically saying that the Saudi officials, they have to prove that he had left the consulate. And just by saying that he left the consulate is not enough for the Turkish officials. And I'm seeing that from the day he disappeared, Turkish officials are releasing information in a very controlled manner. And that to me suggests that given the delicate situation that President Erdogan is in, he really wants to retain the cordial relations between Riyadh and Turkey for several reasons. But he, for a long time, despite the tensions in bilateral relations, he really did not want to criticize Saudi leadership directly. So it's a very delicate situation for him. And the fact that the Turkish officials are releasing information in a very controlled manner tells me that the Turkish officials, President President Erdogan is trying to increase the international pressure on Saudi leadership before he makes a decision on what to do next.
If you could explain a bit, I mean, on the one hand, Turkey and Saudi Arabia appear to be opponents over Qatar, dispute over Qatar, previously over Egypt. And yet at the same time, and as you yourself have written, President Erdogan needs or wants Saudi investments and doesn't want to be too, opposing. So what's the balance there? The issue of the Jamal Khashoggi crisis, just aside for a moment, what's the broader context?
Well, the broader context is, you're right, there's always been tension, and especially with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Turkey is very uneasy with his brand of moderate political Islam, and there are many problems, including Turkey's support for Muslim Brotherhood and the stance that Turkey took on Qatar. But I think the most troublesome development for the Turkish authorities was the fact that the Saudis, they supported the Syrian Kurdish militia in Syria. And pro-government media widely reported that the Saudi officials met with top PKK officials. And even after those reports, President Erdogan did not say a word. And that tells me that he already has a very complicated foreign policy agenda. He already has, the bilateral relations between Turkey and the US is at an all-time low. There are complications with European countries, complications with Russia, with Iran in the region. So I think he just does not want to add more complications.
Far away from the old slogan of no problems with neighbors.
Exactly. And also you have to understand that Turkey is now facing many economic problems, and Saudis are very important.
Thanks, Gonul. Jerry, we're in Washington. How has the U.S. government, let's say, and by government I also mean Congress and so on, it's been a week and some. How have the different institutions reacted or acted so far? What impact has it had just in the last 8-9 days?
Well, I think that that for the administration, this is a nightmare, of course. And if you look at where Saudi Arabia figures in terms of what the United States is trying to accomplish in the region, what the administration has identified as its priorities, the confrontation with Iran, the effort to defeat and destroy violent extremism in the region, the interest in trying to make progress in the Israeli-Palestinian account. Saudi Arabia is a central element of all of those strategies, and therefore, for the administration to be confronted with this issue right now, recognizing that if they push too hard and do major damage to the relationship, it may mean that they don't achieve any of their larger strategic objectives in the region. So they have been tiptoeing past this. I think that there was some criticism of them early on for the slow response that they made to this situation. They seem to then gradually be expanding. President made some stronger comments the other day about the importance of the Saudis coming forward and explaining what happened, perhaps holding those responsible to account for their actions. But now we see that the administration perhaps is pulling back again, and the president has made some comments in which he basically acknowledged that Saudi Arabia is simply too big to fail, if you would, that the relationship is too important to fail, and has been quite open in saying that we're going to have to figure out how to get past this. Hill reaction has been stronger.
The Hill Congress, for those who might not...
Right. Recognizing, of course, that the House of Representatives is not in session, so we really haven't seen anything from that side of the House. But the Senate is in Washington, and there have been a number of senators, including senior Republican senators, Bob Corker, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Lindsey Graham, very senior on the Senate Appropriations Committee, overlooking foreign assistance, as well as Marco Rubio, also a prominent voice in foreign relations issues. So they have been much more vocal in their criticism. mirroring in many ways the domestic media reaction. The Washington Post, of course, has been very strong on this issue. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, really demanding that Saudi Arabia be held to account for this issue.
Where does the Senate matter in the relationship? Of course it does, but explain a bit where and when it might make a difference.
A couple of things, of course. Yesterday, a number of senators wrote a letter to the administration demanding that there be an investigation under the Magnitsky Act for senior Saudis who may be responsible for this. Magnitsky, as you know, was passed initially over allegations of Russian human rights and civil liberties violations, but it is global, and Magnitsky could be applied. Individuals who might have been responsible for Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance could be sanctioned under that legislation. That's one possibility. The other issue, of course, is arms sales and the security assistance relationship. Congress does get a vote on major arms sales. There has already been unhappiness with Saudi Arabia on the Hill because of things like Yemen and some other issues, where we've already seen significant votes against continuing the security assistance relationship with Saudi Arabia, or at least without addressing it and changing it. This, if it's not resolved to people's satisfaction, could make what has been a large plurality of unhappy members of Congress over Saudi relationship actually become a majority, and that would challenge the administration. Now, of course, these votes of disapproval are subject to a veto, which means that the threshold for actually blocking an arms sale is very high. It would require a 2/3 vote in both chambers to overturn a veto. So, but the symbolism of a vote in Congress against major arms sales to Saudi Arabia would be very significant. The other issue, of course, is the administration has very high expectations about advancing the security relationship in the region. They are hoping to have a summit for what they call the Middle East Strategic Alliance, otherwise sometimes referred to as the Arab NATO. If they want to move forward on that, which really has Saudi Arabia at the very center of that relationship, I think that this issue could complicate their ability to really have a successful launch of that kind of initiative.
Thank you, Jerry. Gonul, let me turn back to you. It's been, interesting seeing different sort of positions from Turkish officials. A couple of days, one of the spokesmen sort of seemed to be hinting at a way out. He said, we're not blaming the Saudi state. He said, we in Turkey have had experience with the deep state, and maybe it was some rogue elements and so on. And just before coming into this recording of the podcast, I read that it was announced that Saudi Arabia and Turkey will do a joint investigation of what happened. President Trump had offered, I think, to, if asked, that FBI could help and so on. Do you see that the Turks are looking for a way to resolve this, or a way to leverage it and get something else?
Both are possible. Again, I think this is something that President Erdogan would never wanted to confront. It's a very difficult decision for him. And domestically, after all these, and before that, I would like to say that those leaks by Turkish officials, they could not have happened without approval from President Erdogan. So I think that was a strategy, again, to get some response, particularly from the United States. So I think this is, I think they have to be looking for a way out. But on the other hand, domestically, there's already been a lot of pressure by pro-government circles on President Erdogan to do something about the Saudis. It's not just the Jamal Khashoggi incident, but there were other problems, like the Saudi support for the Syrian Kurdish militia. So Turkish Islamists, for instance, who are close to Erdogan, they think that the brand, the moderate Islam brand that the MBS Crown Prince is representing is just... It's dealing a blow to the soul of real Islam. That's how they see it.
Interesting. Do they see it as you say it as moderate Islam or like secularized Islam? How do
Moderate
they talk
Islam,
about it?
They think that this is a U.S. strategy.
Like a U.S. Islam.
U.S. Islam in a way, and that's why. So there are just too many problems with the Saudis. So I think this was the last blow. And so there's a domestic pressure.
Interesting. You indicated, I mean, that the Turks wanted to get the attention of the Americans. I also noted before coming in that the Turks are releasing the pastor, apparently the American pastor, who's been a bone of contention between Washington and Ankara for many, many, many months. So it's as if, you know, a number of negotiation channels are taking place. Could you shed light on how this crisis could maybe help Turkey leverage something with the U.S., some other deal going on?
Well, certainly. Tomorrow is a big deal for Turkey-U.S. relations. The jailed pastor, he will appear in court. And of course, we don't know whether he will be released, but the pro-government circles are indicating that he could be released because Turkey really wants to resolve some of the tension with the United States. And Turkey could use this case, Khashoggi case, I think, in a scenario where the U.S. is reluctant to do anything. I think it will be very difficult for Turkey to take a direct step against the Saudis. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the communications between the U.S. and Turkish officials, but this is something that could, I think, impact Turkey's international image in a way, because Turkey is one of the top jailers of journalists. So now all eyes are on Turkey. So in a way, Turkey is on the one hand wants to convey to the world that we care about what happens to journalists.
To other journalists.
Other journalists, exactly. And on the other hand, there's a domestic pressure. People are saying that, you know, Turkey is a serious state, and we have to convince all the Arab dissidents who have taken refuge in Turkey that they are safe. So we have to do something about this, and we have to punish the Saudis.
Oh, that's an interesting point, because they are a lot from Egypt, certainly.
Exactly. Many Muslim Brotherhood people. So I think that's why it's a very delicate situation, and that's why I think President Erdogan is waiting for a response from the American side.
Interesting. Thank you. Jerry, interestingly, before this crisis hit, President Trump was being fairly critical on the Saudis. In his UN speech, he was quite vocal about the rising oil prices and sort of saying, look, we protect you, you should keep the oil prices down. In his UN speech, he did not side, I mean, he was neutral on the Qatar issue, which I'm sure doesn't make Saudi Arabia happy. And in his campaign speech rallies, leading up to the midterms, he's also, used that as that they should bring down oil prices and so on. And oil prices affect his electoral base, and coming up to the midterms might affect the U.S. economy, which is his biggest achievement. So this crisis comes at a complex time, let's say, because when Trump was first elected, it was all roses with Saudi Arabia. You didn't sense any tension. But that's not the case right now. So my question is, how do you see it playing into maybe the administration's political calculations? They don't want to break the relationship, but they do want some things from the Saudis. Could they use it as leverage? You've been a diplomat for many years. How might you see this playing out?
Well, it is interesting, and as you said, Paul, and it's very similar to what Gonul is saying about the Saudi-Turkish relationship, which is that there have been these issues. The administration, what we're hearing, there was unhappiness that the Saudis hadn't signed yet an agreement to sell the THAAD system, mm-hmm. which is a new anti-ballistic missile system.
To buy the missile system.
That they were anticipated. In fact, September 30th was the deadline to sign the contract for it. The Saudis let the contract go by. The president was unhappy about that. That's a multi-billion-dollar sale that he wanted to see happen. He was, as you said, unhappy about the rising oil prices that obviously affect consumer attitudes here in the United States and conceivably would have some domestic political ramifications. And also unhappy that the Saudis had so far ignored administration and U.S. Pressure to resolve this issue with Qatar. And again, the extent to which that's impeding and interfering with U.S. broader strategic objectives in the region. So there were issues between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, Mohammed bin Salman gave an interview to Bloomberg News the other day in which he tried to downplay these reports of tensions in the U.S.-Saudi relationship and said, no, the relationship, we have 99 very positive things to say, and if there's one negative thing, then it really doesn't matter very much. And now the shoe is on the other foot, and I think that you see Donald Trump basically doing the same thing, which is say, well, we have these issues, we're concerned, obviously, about Jamal Khashoggi, et cetera, but the relationship is really extremely important, and these
Certainly,
arms sales, these arms sales are a very important part of our economic well-being, and going forward, we want to see these things happen. So each side, I think, recognizes again that there's a limit to how far they want to see this issue affect the broader relationship, and both recognize that at the end of the day, it's very important to try to maintain the ability to work together, even if there are these blips.
Well, yeah, obviously, it's more than a blip, this one. I mean, in a sense, but yeah. I mean, in the broader political sense, but it's really been an issue that has seized Washington, I would say, since it's happened in a way that I haven't seen in quite a while.
This is probably, and it's interesting because I think some people are looking at this also in the context of 9/11 and the stresses and strains on the U.S.-Saudi relationship after the World Trade Center attacks in 2001. And there's a difference, of course, in that there was
those were
that was at least we were able to say that those were individuals acting. There have been allegations, of course, of Saudi government involvement, engagement. We have lawsuits that are still going on in the U.S. over that. But there was an ability for the two sides to say, this was something that happened, but it didn't affect our government-to-government relationship. This is a little bit different because conceivably it does affect, and it was the result of a Saudi government operation, and it does affect the government-to-government relationship. So how this administration, one could say that this is actually the first major foreign policy challenge for this administration since they came into office. It's going to be very interesting to see how they manage it, how they try to avoid doing things that are going to be damaging to U.S. interests.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Gonul and Jerry, for being with us today. We still hope, maybe beyond hope, but hope that Jamal is still alive, and that this has some positive resolution at some point. Our thoughts, as I said, are with his family and others who knew him well. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next week.